If there is no self, who is watching the universe? Part 1. The Observer Paradox. In the quiet moments of life, perhaps during meditation or while contemplating the immensity of the cosmos, a question may gently surface in your mind. It's a question that touches upon the very core of our understanding of ourselves and reality. It goes something like this. If Buddhist philosophy articulates the concept of no self, the absence of a permanent, independent self, often termed anatta, then what exactly is it that is perceiving the universe? What entity is engaged in the act of observation? This inquiry is far from a mere intellectual puzzle for philosophical debates. It represents a genuine point of perplexity, a logical challenge that naturally arises when one encounters the Buddhist doctrine of no self. Let's delve deeper into why this question carries such significance. At its heart, we are dealing with two fundamental concepts: no self and observation. The teaching of no self, Anatta, is a cornerstone of Buddhist philosophy. It proposes that what we commonly perceive as a solid, enduring self is actually an illusion. There is no unchanging, independent entity residing within us that we can call I or mine. This challenges our deeply ingrained sense of selfhood. Conversely, the very notion of observation inherently implies an observer, an agent performing the act of seeing, experiencing, and knowing. It suggests a subject that is distinct from the object being observed. And here lies the apparent paradox. If, as Buddhism suggests, there is fundamentally no self, then who or what is undertaking this process of observation? Who is the watcher if there is no one to watch? This question isn't solely a hurdle for newcomers to Buddhist thought. Even experienced practitioners, as their comprehension of anatta deepens, may find themselves revisiting this very question. It's a point of contemplation that encourages ongoing inquiry and refinement of understanding. Intriguingly, this line of questioning also finds echoes within the scientific domain. Consider quantum physics, where the observer effect has been a subject of considerable discussion. In the quantum realm, the act of observing a system appears to alter its behavior, blurring the lines between observer and observed, and raising profound questions about the nature of observation itself. Is there a truly detached observer, or is observation inherently participatory? The reason this question feels so potent stems from the ingrained patterns of our ordinary minds. Our conventional cognitive framework naturally tends to create demarcations, to perceive the world in terms of separate, independent units. We conceptualize ourselves as individuals, bounded and distinct from the external world, and separate from other individuals. This deeply rooted cognitive habit predisposes us to assume that for any act of observation to occur, there must necessarily be a discrete observer, a dedicated watcher, standing apart from the object being observed. It's akin to instinctively assuming that a ship, even one sailing smoothly on autopilot, must have a captain actively at the helm. This seeming contradiction is not a modern invention. Even during the Buddha's era, seekers grappled with analogous inquiries concerning the self and the nature of experience. In a well-known discourse with Vacchagotta, a wandering ascetic, the Buddha faced direct interrogations about the existence or non-existence of self. Instead of offering a definitive affirmation or negation, the Buddha chose to remain silent. This silence was not a failure to respond, but a deliberate and insightful teaching method. It indicated that sometimes the very structure of our questions can lead us down misleading paths. The Buddha's silence implied that rigid adherence to fixed viewpoints even about concepts as profound as self and no self, can impede genuine understanding and insight. Question: who is watching? May itself be predicated on a flawed understanding of what both self and watching truly signify in the Buddhist context. Therefore, in our exploration together, we will methodically unravel this compelling question. We will investigate what we commonly understand by self and meticulously examine the actual processes involved in observation. By gaining a more nuanced and profound grasp of these concepts, we can begin to dissolve this apparent contradiction. Perhaps, in doing so, we may uncover a more liberating and deeply insightful perspective on our own being and the universe that surrounds us. The objective is not to arrive at a simplistic solution, but to cultivate a richer comprehension of the question itself. And within that deepened understanding, a transformative shift in perspective becomes possible. Part 2. The illusion of self. In our daily conversations, the word self comes up effortlessly. We use it to describe a deeply personal sensation, that intimate feeling of me, a distinct individual existing within a body, experiencing thoughts, emotions, and memories. This self often feels like a continuous presence, an inner voice constantly shaping our personal identity and coloring our perception of the world. It's this sense of a stable, internal I that we instinctively rely on to navigate life. However, both modern scientific understanding and ancient Buddhist wisdom present a compelling challenge to this ingrained belief in a fixed self. From the perspective of neuroscience, the self is no longer seen as a singular, localized entity residing within the brain. Instead, cutting-edge research reveals it to be a remarkably intricate construct, skillfully assembled and maintained by the dynamic interplay of distributed neural networks across various brain regions. There isn't a specific identifiable self-center waiting to be pinpointed on a brain scan. Rather, our subjective experience of self emerges from the coordinated activity of numerous brain processes. These involve areas crucial for memory formation and recall. Our moment-to-moment awareness of our physical body, the complex landscape of our emotions, and even our capacity for abstract thought. It's akin to a constantly evolving narrative, woven together by the brain from moment to moment, a fluid and dynamic process, not a static, unchanging core. Buddhist philosophy, through its profound system of the 5 aggregates, skandhas, also offers a detailed deconstruction of what we commonly perceive as self. These 5 aggregates, traditionally listed as form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, are presented not as parts of a self, but as the very components that constitute what we mistakenly identify as a self. It's like examining a chariot and realizing it's not a single entity, but simply a collection of wheels, axles, frame, and so on. Crucially, Buddhist teachings emphasize that none of these aggregates, individually or collectively, embody a permanent, independent, or unchanging essence of self. Form, rupa, encompasses our physical body and the material world around us. Feeling, vedana, includes all sensations, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Perception, sana, is the process of interpreting sensory information and assigning meaning. Mental formations, sankhara, are our thoughts, intentions, volitions, and beliefs, the mental habits that shape our experience. And consciousness, vijnana, is the basic awareness that arises with each moment of sensory or mental experience. Buddhism invites us to investigate our direct experience and discover that only these constantly shifting aggregates are present, arising and dissolving in a continuous flow. The ingrained sense of a solid self is seen as an illusion, born from our tendency to grasp at these impermanent aggregates as if they were truly me, mine, or myself. Thus, both science and Buddhism converge on the understanding that the self we experience is a dynamic, ever-changing process, not a fixed, independent thing. A crucial insight as we now turn to explore the nature of observation itself. Part 3. The nature of observation. Let's now focus solely on the nature of observation itself, particularly from a Buddhist perspective. What truly occurs when we observe something? In our daily lives, it seems like a straightforward act. We see, we hear, we sense. But when we examine this process through the lens of Buddhist philosophy, a more nuanced picture emerges. In Buddhism, observation is fundamentally understood as a dynamic process of sense contact. The Buddhist model outlines 6 sense bases, or sense faculties: the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, which processes thoughts and mental objects. Observation arises when one of these sense bases comes into contact with its corresponding sense object. For example, the eye, sense base, contacts a visual form, sense object. The ear, sense base, contacts a sound, sense object. This contact is the condition for the arising of consciousness. Crucially, this arising of consciousness is not attributed to a self or a watcher. Instead, it is explained through the principle of dependent origination, pratitya samutpada. Consciousness arises because of specific conditions: the presence of a sense base, a sense object, and the contact between them. For instance, visual consciousness arises because there is an eye, a visual form, and the condition of light enabling their interaction. When these conditions are present, visual consciousness arises. When these conditions cease, visual consciousness ceases. It's a process of dependent arising, not the action of an independent observer. The 6 sense bases and their corresponding objects are eye and visual forms, leading to visual consciousness; ear and sounds, leading to auditory consciousness; nose and smells, leading to olfactory consciousness; tongue and tastes, leading to gustatory consciousness; body and tactile sensations, leading to tactile consciousness; mind, sense base, and mental objects, sense object, thoughts, ideas, emotions, leading to mental consciousness. In each case, consciousness is understood as arising dependently, not independently. There is no separate entity initiating or controlling this process. It's simply the natural unfolding of cause and condition. Memory and perception also play a role in shaping our experience of observation within this framework. While the initial sense contact is a bare arising of consciousness, our past experiences, memories, and perceptual frameworks influence how we interpret and understand what is sensed. Perception, sana, as one of the 5 aggregates, is precisely this process of interpreting and categorizing sensory information, adding meaning and context to the raw data of sense contact. However, even these cognitive processes are seen as dependent and impermanent, not belonging to a fixed self. Therefore, from a Buddhist perspective, observation is not about a watcher looking at a world. It's about the dynamic and interdependent process of sense contact, the arising of consciousness, and the subsequent shaping of experience through perception and other mental factors. all unfolding without a central, independent observer. This understanding sets the stage for resolving our initial paradox. Part 4. Resolving the paradox. We've explored how the Buddhist concept of no-self, anatta, dismantles the idea of a permanent, independent self, and how Buddhist understanding of observation centers on selfless sense contact. Now we can directly address our core question. If there is no self, then who is watching the universe? The liberating resolution is this: observation unfolds naturally, without anyone inherently doing the watching. The initial question creates a paradox because it mistakenly assumes that observation must be performed by a separate, distinct observer. Buddhism challenges this very assumption. The Buddha's profound teaching to the monk 𝐵𝐴 directly addresses this misunderstanding. In a remarkably concise yet deeply insightful statement, he declared, "In the seen, there is simply the seen. In the heard, there is simply the heard. In the sensed, there is simply the sensed. In the cognized, there is simply the cognized." Let's unpack the meaning of this powerful statement. When visual consciousness arises from the meeting of the eye and a visual object, there is just the process of seeing itself unfolding. There is no need to posit a separate seer behind the eyes, actively watching the visual scene as if it were projected on a screen. The act of seeing is the complete event in itself, whole and self-contained. Similarly, when auditory consciousness arises from the ear's contact with sound, there is simply the dynamic process of hearing taking place. There is no separate hearer required, distinct from the act of hearing itself, to validate or complete the experience. Hearing is the event. This principle of direct, unmediated experience extends to all sensory modalities: smell, taste, touch. In each case, there is simply the impersonal sensory process dynamically unfolding based on conditions. Perhaps most surprisingly, this principle even applies to mental experience, thoughts, emotions, ideas. When mental consciousness arises from the mind's engagement with a mental object, there is simply the process of mental cognition. No separate thinker or cognizer is needed to initiate or oversee the process of thought. The Buddha's teaching to 𝐵𝐴 points to a radical simplicity and directness at the heart of all experience. Experience is not something mediated or performed by a separate self. It is simply the arising and passing of sensory and mental events, conditioned by various factors, yet not orchestrated by a central watcher. We can catch glimpses of this selfless awareness in our daily lives, especially during moments of flow. When deeply absorbed in an activity, like playing music or engaging in a sport, self-referential thoughts quiet down. There's just the pure, unmediated experience of the activity itself unfolding. In these moments, the sense of a separate self as the actor or observer temporarily fades, revealing a more direct and effortless awareness. Therefore, the question, "Who is watching the universe?" is ultimately misdirected. Know who is watching. Observation is not an act performed by a self. It is a natural, impersonal process occurring due to conditions. Just as a river flows without a separate river doer, observation happens without a separate observer. This understanding is key to resolving the paradox. It frees us from the mistaken notion of a burdened self, constantly striving to observe and control an external world. Part 5. The Liberation of Understanding. Understanding that no one is watching the universe offers profound liberation. The illusion of a separate, constantly observing self is a heavy burden. It breeds isolation, anxiety, and a sense of lack. Releasing this self-concept brings significant relief, like setting down a heavy weight. Suddenly, there's lightness, freedom, and a more direct, open experience, unfiltered by self-consciousness. Science increasingly validates these benefits. Mindfulness and meditation practices, which cultivate a sense of non-self, are shown to reduce stress, anxiety, and depression. Research suggests that letting go of excessive self-focus fosters improved emotional regulation, greater compassion, and enhanced well-being. The Buddha emphasized that attachment to the illusion of self is the root of suffering. Realizing non-self is the path to liberation, fundamentally transforming our experience of reality. As the Dhammapada states, all conditioned things are suffering. All things are not self. This understanding has practical applications. Reduced self-centeredness. Recognizing the constructed nature of self naturally lessens self-preoccupation. This fosters greater compassion and kindness towards others, seeing ourselves as interconnected rather than isolated. Enhanced resilience. Without rigid self-identification, we become less reactive to life's changes. We navigate challenges with more equanimity. Understanding experiences are impermanent, not personal failures. Deeper, present moment appreciation. Quieting self-chatter allows us to fully appreciate the richness of immediate experience. Life becomes more vibrant and meaningful as we become attuned to the present. Ultimately, understanding non-self shifts consciousness from a limited, contracted sense of self to a more expansive, interconnected awareness. It's a move from feeling like a separate drop to realizing we are the ocean itself, vast and boundless. This isn't nihilistic emptiness, but a discovery of a deeper, more liberating ground of being beyond the confines of the constructed self. No one watching unlocks a more peaceful, compassionate, and liberated life, inviting us to embrace a wider reality and discover inherent freedom and joy.